what a waste the ICC was at that bookstore in Kansas.
Excuse me?
We were talking about what a waste the ICC was at that bookstore in Kensington. We had a talk on the board.
Mark Opsasnick talk?
ICC bookstore, Kensington. Well, there was a Borders in Kensington.
Was that at that Kensington Road bookshop? Was that when he talked? That was like in 2008, right? I take it was he was doing a Morrison talk. Jim Morrison talk.
We got to talking about the ICC and everybody agrees. Yeah, it's a waste of money. It's not worth $275 to get the rock. Then they build it. Now I can get from White Oak to my barber in Shady Grove in 20 minutes. You almost complete privacy.
Well, it's building. It's building. You know, it's building when there's accidents. There's more and more accidents out there. A tractor trailer overturned out there last week.
Make sure this is
Anyway, no, I think it's a good thing. I like the look. They really treated it in, made it nice and green. Spent a lot of money.
Okay, well,
it's about 40 years.
I'm going to have to go up.
They blame all the governors. They put the kibosh on it for too long. But yeah, I'm glad it's done. It's smart.
You stand up there and party. Watch him. I'm just up there now.
That would like I said, I thought it was ridiculous. I had to get a season pass and we got to talk to. But then I brought on and I said, I can be wrong.
Good afternoon, everybody. I don't want to move this, so it's perfectly placed for Mark, so I'm going to talk like this. Actually, my name's Jeff Krulik, and I'm a friend of Mark's and a friend of the New Deal Cafe and a friend of Dorian Winterfeld, who I grew up with, who I went to him, I said, I'm doing an intro for Mark, and Dorian just went, a man who needs no introduction, but in fact I'm going to do just that. And I wrote down some notes. I have some remarks here I made, so I hope you don't mind, Mark, everybody, but Mark and I have known each other for over 20 years. We met through our mutual friend Ann, who worked with Mark, and told me, I think you'll really like meeting my coworker. I had already purchased Capitol Rock from Imagination Books in Silver Spring. We arranged to meet, and clearly we hit it off, finding common ground and common interests, and so we started to hang out more regularly, the three of us, visiting area bars and restaurants in Prince George's County to, as we like to call it, soak up the vibe. It was the three of us, Mark, Ann, and myself. And then pretty soon, it was just Mark and I getting together, which amused Ann as I seemed to steal Mark away from her. I've clearly lost track of how much time we've been together. But over these 20 plus years of friendship, I've been a great admirer of Mark's intense singular focus on his many projects, large and small. Too numerous to name. One of my earliest nicknames for Mark, I used to call him the Great One, which I'm sure I hatched with Ann not long after I met him, clearly inspired by my admiration for his dedication. But when Mark asked me to do this intro, I decided to go back into an email folder I have titled The Great One, to take you inside his latest Herculean effort, which we are celebrating here today. I mean, who else is going to top Mark than Mark himself? So going back to 2008, a couple of emails. June 27th, 2008. Being stuck in this friggin' office is killing me. It takes me 2 hours to complete a search of 1 year's worth of teen columns in the Washington Star. But I did 1964 the other night and got tons of cool stuff. However, it takes so long to do it, and I can only get there once or twice a week. This day job is killing me and preventing me from doing what I want to do. September 5th, 2008. I cannot reiterate enough how much working this job sucks. Never get tied down into a crappy situation like this. I could have gotten so much stuff done at the libraries this week, but I'm enslaved here in this horrible pit of doom. Never, never, never get a 9-to-5 job. On top of that, the Redskins suck.
They still do.
That was 2008. November 19th, 2008. Tapes everywhere. Worst nightmare. I put it in a CD-ROM last night and my computer went on the blitz. If I lost any files, I'm sunk. March 16th, 2009. I must stop adding names to the interview list. Every day more pour in. It must stop. I'm trying to do 10 interviews per week. One during the day on my lunch hour and one at night, Monday through Thursday. If I can keep this up through the end of April, I'll feel like I've made some progress. Okay, 2011, folks. After 5 years of working on this thing, I now have an unofficial working title for the new book, Rock the Potomac, a historical survey of popular music and early area rock and roll in the Washington, D.C. area. February 12th, 2013. I want this damn book done before I die. But it might kill me first. It is going so slow. May 2013, May 8th. I have now transcribed 50 of my taped interviews. I have 48 tapes left to go, plus whatever I interview along the way. It is amazing how much work I have to put into this, but now I feel there's at least a light at the end of the tunnel. You get the idea here. I'm showing you how much work really went into this. Let's go to October 2015. Help! I need the following on Joe Hasselvander. Where did he grow up? Name of city and town. Where did he go to high school? And what year did he graduate? What bands was he in as a teenager? Okay. 2018, here's the final version. That was October. October 2018, the drama continues. I make more corrections and send them off. Book Locker makes the corrections. I think, now they say they won't fix anymore. Anyway, I'll call you this week. October 23rd, 2018, the publisher says the book is, in fact, too many pages, and they have to increase the book's dimensions. I think this is a blessing, because the size is now 7 by 10. That's fine with me. Stay tuned. And January 2nd this year, this version supersedes all other copies. This is the final version of the book, Rock the Potomac. Later that month, the announcement goes out. My latest book, Rock the Potomac, Popular Music and Earlier Era Rock and Roll in the Washington, D.C. area, is now available. Order it here at Amazon, or come here today to the New Deal Cafe for Mark's book signing of his latest, greatest magnum opus. Ladies and gentlemen, Mark Opsasnick. Greenbelt, Maryland's Mark Opsasnick. My good, dear friend. Congratulations, Mark.
All right, thanks a lot, Jeff. I really appreciate those kind words. And before we get started, I want to thank everybody for coming out. Look at the turnout. This is pretty amazing. I started this project, back in 2006, and dreamed that this day would one day get here, where the damn thing was done and available to the public. So I really appreciate you coming out. Just want to say a couple things. They are serving a brunch menu here at the New Deal till 3 o'clock or so feel free to order some food and get some drinks. I'm going to try to go quickly up here, but it does take a while because I like to run my mouth a lot. So, and then when I'm done, I will be out in the front room signing books. If you want to come by and look at it or buy a copy, that's fine. And we will have live music. I tell you, before I talk about, the book is actually called Rock the Potomac. It's 811 pages, and that was after cutting about 350 to get it down to size. And unfortunately, 200 pages of that was a listing of the entire listing of the Howard Theater, every live advertised show from 1910 to 1977. I spent 2 years looking it up, and out of the Washington Afro-American and the Washington Bee and other papers, and we just couldn't get it in there. That'll be another project. But just to give you some background on how this all worked out, I grew up in Greenbelt, Maryland, and so I've been here my whole life, and that's a long time. Grew up on rock and roll, had an older brother and sister. I, was preteen listening to the Beatles and the Monkees and Paul Revere and the Raiders, and early 70s it switched. All of a sudden, I started, as high school approached, I got into, the really good stuff, Alice Cooper and Led Zeppelin and Grand Funk Railroad and Blue Oyster Cult and Deep Purple and Rush and, everything, and Foghat. And so I love rock and roll. We'll fast forward. I got out of University of Maryland in '84. Late 80s, I was contributing articles to a great magazine called Strange Magazine, which was done by dear friend Mark Chervinsky, God rest his soul, out in Rockville, Maryland. I was writing about UFOs and Bigfoot, the really important issues in life. Hey, your government has spent a lot of money on the UFO thing. Don't laugh. It's, man, who knows. Anyway, I tell you, it started because, having grown up in Greenbelt, we were up in Hillside, 13 Court. And a family lived there, the Leach family. They were neighbors of ours. And in 1989, a fellow from Greenbelt named Tim Leach, our old neighbor, bought a restaurant on Kenilworth Avenue in Riverdale. It was the old Bambino's restaurant. It had later been called the Riverside Inn. It had been like a heavy metal type club, and it was Handley's. When he bought it, it was Ed Holson's Pizza Heaven. He turned it into the Riverdale Pizza Pub. So I was going down there 5 and 6 nights a week and hanging out. And I tell you, I started just listening to the old timers. You had two groups in there. You had the old timers and the older timers. And the old timers, there's a lot of these guys who they had been in the Pagans Motorcycle Club. And they had, retired or, gotten out of jail or whatever they did and wound up sitting down there. And these arguments would ensue late in the evening. They're talking about these great musicians out of Prince George's County, Maryland. And I'd been a fan of rock and roll, but I never paid too much attention during my college years to the local stuff. I'd go to the Paragon and all that, but I was never really into the band members and checking everything out. Anyway, 4 guys kept coming up over and over and over, and these guys would get into these heated arguments. And the one thing was, the greatest guitarist to ever come out of this area was Roy Buchanan, and he used to play down the road at the Crossroads, late 60s, early 70s with Danny Denver and the Soundmasters, and somebody else would chime in. No. Danny Gatton was the best. He was the greatest ever. He's the greatest in the world, and Gatton was a homeboy. He had grown up on Elmira Street Southwest. It's actually southwest, right on the southeast border, but Gatton had gone to Ballou High School in Southeast for 2 years, which nobody realizes. Family moved out to Oxon Hill his senior year, graduated from Oxon Hill in '63, and you're saying, we saw Gatton play, the Cottage City Colmar Manor Fire Department. We saw him at the Crossroads with Danny and the Fat Boys. He played with East Coast Express at Gus and John's and Camp Springs. They're saying he was the best. Then the older guys would chime in and they say, no, there's two guitarists you're missing. The absolute greatest was Roy Clark, who had grown up on Yuma Street Southeast over in Highland Dwellings in Southeast DC. He went to Chamberlain Vocational High School. He came out and married a Bladensburg high school girl named Barbara, and they're saying Roy Clark used to be the house guitarist at the Dixie Pig on Bladensburg Road over in Cottage City, and he used to play Strix, and he was all over. And he was actually a rock and roll guitarist in the 50s. And then the other guys would say, nope, the best was Link Ray, legendary guitarist, and he came up to DC in the 50s and used to play all the really ass-kicking rough bars around DC, like Vinnie's Grill, which was at 10th and H, and in the mid-60s he was the house guitarist at the 1023 restaurant in Southeast DC. So anyway, and other names started coming up. You listen to these guys, they're talking about Nils Lofgren and Punky Meadows and Jack Cassidy, who's in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame for Jefferson Airplane. He used to play bass in a bunch of bands here. He was from Tenleytown, Northwest DC. He was the Wilson High class of '62. So I'm taking all this in, and I'm thinking, where am I going to find information on this? Remember, this is like 89 to 93. There's no internet yet, or it was in its formative stages. And there were no books written about these guys where you could just pull them up and read their profiles. And I thought, well, I'm going to give it a shot. And I started talking to musicians and following the trail. And it eventually became our first book, which was called Capital Rock. I started researching that in January of '93. It was finished in December of '96. It served to profile local musicians and bands that kind of went on to some sort of national recognition. Okay, now when you do that, the book came out and it was pretty much well received, but it was definitely a very strange book because you leave so much out. You can't get everything. And of course, then you hear from the guys that you leave out and then don't cover. And some of those guys aren't, quite so nice about it. Anyway, most people liked it. They appreciated the effort. But it was definitely, the emphasis was on, bands and musicians that went on beyond DC. And there wasn't a whole lot, but it did cover Gatton, Buchanan, Roy Clark, and Punky Meadows and Nils. I did interviews with them. And the Cherry People, a great band, Raz, a band that should have made it really big. Anyway, you get the picture. Okay, I continued writing. I worked for 28 years for the Montgomery County Department of Health and Human Services, and as documented in those incriminating emails, which I never thought would be made public, that I sent to Jeff Krulik, I wasn't totally in love with my job. So, at the end of 28 years, I was bordering on, Charles Manson-like behavior. We won't get into that. I just had to get out and take care of some family stuff, so I retired early. In the meantime, I've written a total of 8 books now, but through the years, I started covering other topics. Did a book called The Real Story Behind the Exorcist that was very popular. Another one that I was really proud of, The Life and Times of Jim Morrison in Alexandria, Virginia. It was called The Lizard King Was Here. I went back and interviewed all his high school buddies, and that actually, sold very well. And they say, the weird thing with that is, they say Morrison faked his death and, absconded to Africa. And, one day I'm looking at the sales and there's 1 book sold to Morocco. I'm thinking, I don't know if, it just kind of made me wonder. So, but anyway, that book is pretty cool. It has a chapter from one of his very good friends, a guy named Bill Thomas, who claims that he saw Morrison in Arizona in recent years. But you got to buy the book to read that. So, all right. What I wanted to do was talk about the current book, Rock the Potomac. All right. So in 2006, I finished up The Lizard King Was Here, and I had put together 5 articles I'd written for Strange Magazine. That were on various types of unexplained phenomena. I put it together under the title, The Real Story Behind the Exorcist. It has chapters on the Goat Man, Crybaby Bridge, the unknown Luso-Brazilian black magic cult that would abduct co-eds at the University of Maryland campus in 1969 and 70 and, do crazy things to them, and they didn't know if it was real or not. And I actually, that article, I interviewed the actual members, 30 years later or whatever, and talked to them, but it was a big joke. Anyway, you can read about all that stuff. And incidentally, I was very happy when, one of my good friends from that period at Strange Magazine, Greg Snook, the great graphic designer, and he is in Rock the Potomac under Joe Ray Realite. Greg is here. Greg, just wave. I know you don't like attention, but it's so good seeing you. I mean, it's really pretty cool that you came out. I really appreciate it. We had great experiences. I love Mark Chervinsky, who ran Strange Magazine. Those were great times, and we explored some great stuff with it. The 3 of us were part of a search one time to Selbyville, Delaware, in search of the Selbyville swamp monster, and we wrote it up in the magazine, but, I digress. Anyway, we spent time in Ocean City. It's so good seeing Greg after all this time. Anyway, okay, 2006 rolling around. I'm finishing up with The Lizard King Was Here, totally disgruntled with my freaking horrible, social service job, and I'm thinking, what am I going to do next? I can go down the New Deal didn't have a liquor license yet. So, that's one option. But I came down here anyway. So anyway, what I was doing at that time, the internet was okay, but if you wanted to read like the Washington Post and these newspapers, you had to go to the library. So I'm at the University of Maryland McKeldin Library, and you go back and there's these cabinets, and they're unmarked. There's a section that's unmarked. It's like the secret microfilm that no one is supposed to read, but they didn't have padlocks on them or anything. And I tell you, this is the truth as it happened, as I remember it. Who knows if it's accurate or not, but I went and opened up one of the drawers, and there's just, there's a bunch of microfilm rolls, and I pulled one out. It's unmarked, and I put it in the reader and scanned it, and the first time I stopped, I'm like, oh my God, there's like little, I can't call them ads or articles, but it's like a newspaper from the 1700s, and I'm looking at this thing, and it's an ad for The Beggar's Opera, a play that was being held at something called the New Theater, and then I looked, Upper Marlboro, Maryland, with, let me see if I have this here, with instrumental songs and music, and that's what caught my eye. So they're actually doing plays and having people perform music. And I'm looking through this, and I thought, it dawned on me, I don't think this has ever seen the light of day. And I went and I spent probably the next year or so reading every issue of the newspaper, but it was only like 4 pages, 6 pages, 8 pages, but I copied everything out of there. And then a couple months later, that was from August of 1752, the Maryland Gazette newspaper. A couple months later, in October 52, they had a little ad for a concert of music at a facility called the Ballroom. The Beggar's Play was at the New Theater. This other thing was called the Ballroom in Upper Marlboro, and I'm thinking it had to be the same place. So I'm intrigued. I went and searched for, I guess the paper went on into the late 1700s, and I just came out with all this material, and eventually it was something called the Assembly Room. They called it, it was built in 1752. It was called the New Theater, the Ballroom, and the Assembly Room. But I had all this stuff, and it just dawned on me, you know, I found my new project. I can't let this go. And like all my projects, I just start at point A and go to Z. It took on a life of its own. When I finished compiling this information, I thought, well, I have a new book, but you know, I'm a rock and roll guy, and I don't think they're playing rock and roll in 1752. At least they weren't really calling it that. But I then found the National Daily Intelligencer, which was the Washington, D.C. daily newspaper. I went through that, and I came across another, what I thought was an amazing discovery, and I read a chapter of this on the book. It was the Advent of Vaudeville. There was a place called Olympic Saloon in Washington, D.C., and in January 1845, it was the first example of vaudeville being performed, not just in D.C., but in America. And I thought, that's never been revealed before. And I did all kinds of Google searches. I really think I stumbled onto something. So I do the whole history of Olympic Saloon and all that. Next thing you know, the project was taking shape. I go and kind of go in chronological order the best I can. I include, going from the Assembly Room of Upper Marlboro in the 1700s into D.C. Popular music was only seen and heard in the theaters in the early 1800s. Then a few choice concert halls and saloons. I give you a whole rundown of all of that in the book. When you hit the early 1900s, the restaurant owners started getting upset because in order to hear music, they would go to these vaudeville presentations in the theaters. So you had a handful of restaurant owners who started booking small ensembles, 2- and 3-man, 4-man groups, to play music in the restaurants to keep the customers there. And that was the advent of the nightclub. And I go into the earliest examples of nightclubs in Washington, D.C. You had the Better Old Nightclub, 1515 U Street. That building is still there. It's pretty amazing. A place called the Crazy Cat, which was like the first bohemian nightclub. That was sometime, there's a whole section on it, but the Swanee was a nightclub in the basement of the Earl Theater, which became the Warner Theater. I went and saw Little Feet there, like 2 years ago, and I went looking for the old Swanee nightclub. And the basement area is still there, but it's totally reconfigured. So anyway, we go into the nightclubs, and I just follow the trail from there. 1930s and 40s, Prohibition went out. The New Deal came in under Franklin Roosevelt. D.C. started growing, the suburbs started filling up. In D.C. it was the big band era, the 30s and the 40s. Jack Jive Schaefer and Billy Strickland and the Capitolonians at the Lotus, and Jack Jive Schaefer at the Casino Royal. And for the 30s and 40s, I document all that, the hotel bars, the classier nightclubs of D.C. It was very curious. By 1950, things had really changed drastically. And this is it's just a fact when you look back. 1950 census, DC's population was 802,000. Over 500,000 were white Americans, and almost all of them were from the South. DC was a southern city. And this is documented, in the newspapers and the nightclub ad, and country music just exploded in this town. You wouldn't know it today. They kind of forgotten all about all that, and they don't publicize it much, but I go into how country music developed. Connie B. Gay came up from Lizard Lick, North Carolina, and started booking, these old nightclubs, and he had the Joe Turner Arena at 14th and W, and running that out for the old town and country jamborees. It was televised. You had all these great country and western musicians come in. You had Jimmy Dean and the Texas Wildcats, and Grandpa Jones and Roy Clark was playing it. Simultaneously, there were other sections of D.C. that also had vibrant music scenes. I do an extensive chapter on the development of U Street. I call it the face of U Street. And back then, they spelled it Y-O-U. And the interesting thing, nowadays they look back and they say, well, that was Black Broadway. I've never seen a single reference. I went through the entire Washington Afro-American at the Martin Luther King Library. Never saw a single reference to U Street being called the Black Broadway. But what I did do was I did a whole chapter on the development of the Howard Theater, and it's very surprising when you see who had that place built. And evenly throughout it was a vaudeville house originally. 30s and 40s and 50s, they had just as many, white American performers as they did, black performers. At the time they called it Negro music, which was not a derogatory term, it's just how it was. That's all ignored today, but I bring it back to life in this book. I highlight, the Three Stooges did one of their rare DC appearances on the Howard Theater stage. When Buddy Holly and the Crickets appeared in the first week of August 1957, They were at the Howard Theater. They were second billed to Clyde McPhatter, and the house band was Rick Henderson's orchestra. Pop stars played there, Bobby Darin, and I found a thing for Roy Rogers, the country singer, playing at the Howard Theater. It was just, the point is, it's just a lot more, in terms of musical entertainment, a lot of diversity there, which is ignored today. But I tried to accentuate the fact that it was a theater that was open to everybody and they had some great music. I do the whole U Street thing. The Casbah, Club Ballet. The guy who owned Club Ballet, who had that opened it up, it was David Rosenberg, a white Jewish guy, and he had it as a spot restaurant, turned it into Club Ballet. Then he built a building at 815 V Street, called it the Music Hall. And I think Louis Armstrong was the first performer there, and they had a mix of black and white entertainers in there. Duke Ellington took it over. It became Duke Ellington's Nightclub for a while in the late 40s. Today that building, it was WUST Music Hall. Today that is the 930 Club. So, but I go back and tell you, who had it built, who owned it, and who played there, and pretty in-depth chapter. So all this stuff is developing. You have, by the 50s, country music was huge. I have the whole thing on U Street. Then rock and roll came in. Okay, and this is how rock and roll developed, and people take issue with this. Did rock and roll actually start when people were playing what later became known as rock and roll music? Or did it begin when somebody coined the term rock and roll to describe, as a noun, to describe a separate style of music? And my contention is that, you had a lot of people. I give an example of 125 different single releases from like the 1920s to 1952, 1922 to 1952, that used what I call rock and roll terminology in the title. Rock, rocks, rockin', or rock and roll itself. Like, John Lee Hooker had a single in 1950 called Rock and Roll. So, rock and roll goes back to 1950. Well, not really. Rock and roll was a euphemism for sex. And at some point, go figure. So at some point they took that euphemism, and Alan Freed claims that he appropriated that term and applied it to the music he was playing on his Moondog House radio station in Cleveland, Ohio in late 1951. Okay, that's the first reference we have to somebody claiming they coined the term rock and roll and created rock and roll. The problem is there's not one shred of evidence that shows that Freed actually did that. He joined WJW radio in Cleveland in early '51 as a classical music disc jockey. They changed the name of his show, I think it was November 14, '51, to the Moondog House. The first time Freed ever mentioned that he started calling his music rock and roll was on a 1962 album called Alan Freed's Top 15. It was released in 1962 on End Records, and he said, I called our music, I created the name for our music rock and roll in 1951. So they accept that, but I've never heard a single recording from any Alan Freed Moondog House radio show in 1951 where he used the term rock and roll. I don't know. What is a fact, though, is that by 1952, rock and roll was being used around the country to describe, as a noun, to describe a new type of music. Prior to that time, the Billboard, which was the top trade publication, they labeled their music pop, folk, or, which actually is pop. Originally it was folk, that got switched to country and western. And originally it was race music, which was switched, Negro music to race music, which was switched to rhythm and blues. So, in 1951 you had pop, you had country and western, you had rhythm and blues. It was mainly defined by the colors of the entertainers more than anything else. If you're playing jazz, how come you're not in any of the Billboard charts? Well, if you're a white jazz musician, it's pop. If you're a black jazz musician, it's rhythm and blues. Everything was separated. And that's the way it was accepted that way. It's an important point to make, because that's how records promoted their material. The 45s and the 33s came out in the late 40s, and that's kind of how they promoted their stuff. So anyway, Freed claims that he started rock and roll in '51. What I know for a fact, what's germane to this book, is that in March of '52, I started finding the first references for rock and roll bands playing in the DC area, and it all started with a band called Murray Schaff's Aristocrats from Philadelphia. They came down and they played a nightclub on Marlboro Pike called the Hilltop Restaurant. It was on Marlboro Pike in what is now called Coral Hills, Maryland, right near the DC line across from Capitol Heights. I then go into a pretty in-depth study of all the various nightclubs of DC that started then, in the wake of Murray Schaff's Aristocrats playing the Hilltop. other bands that started playing. The Howard Theater started like, Tiny Grimes and his Rocking Highlanders will play rock and roll for you, and, Big Joe Turner, the proponent of rockin', and it's in the ads. The Blue Mirror started booking bands. They brought in Bill Haley and his Comets in June of '53, who had the hit song Crazy Man Crazy, advertised him as a rock and roll artist. There's a place in far southeast, long forgotten, Jack Rose Restaurant. I do a whole history on that. And Mara Cherkasky is here. She helped me pull up like the whole history of that club, like whenever because it got knocked down. We wanted to find out the date that it was torn down in the 60s, but she helped out with that. But I got fascinated. It was Southeast DC, but they had a mix of white and black rhythm and blues entertainers. They had Joe Lagana, the Italian rock and roll singer, one night. The next night they had the famous Don Covey, who wrote a bunch of great songs. He was an R&B singer. But anyway, Bladensburg Road got into the act. They had a lot of bars out there, the Dixie Pig, the Rustic Cabin, the Surf Club. The Wheel Bar was the place that really kicked it off out there. It was across the street from the Dixie Pig in the 3800 block of Bladensburg Road. They started advertising rock and roll sessions with the Three Jacks, and it just caught on throughout the whole area. The Quonset Supper Club started having rock and roll. Strick's Restaurant down in Silver Hill on Branch Avenue near the DC line. And along with, when I say rock and roll was advertised, you had nightclubs, you had great bands playing it. The 50s was a great time. To me, it was the golden era. I wasn't born until '62. So I never saw any of these bands. I guess I don't really know what I'm talking about, but it's what I have seen others write about. And I've talked to musicians, but there was a handful of what I thought it was really significant. You had Murray Schaff's Aristocrats coming down from Philadelphia. They played the 4400 Club on Rhode Island Avenue, and they played the Blue Mirror, and they played the Hilltop. You had Roy Clark and his, what the heck, what was this place on Starliners? I forget what he calls his club now. It was Danny Denver and the Sound Masters. I think it was Roy Clark and the Stardusters, but they were the house band at the Strix and some other places. They were billed as rock and roll. They played the 4400, they played the Crossroads. Okay, you had bands playing the nightclubs, but you also had 2 or 3 bands in the late 50s that I think were very influential, seminal in nature, more important than anything out there, since, because the way they broke new ground. They were younger guys. A lot of them were teenagers, and they played the teen dance scene, the record hop scene. They started playing the Don Dillard and Milt Grant record hops around the area. And then they graduated to playing the nightclub scene, which was very unusual. And the 3 that really came to mind, I profiled them in the book. The Off Keys, which featured Sammy Palladino. They were out of Bladensburg High School in the late 50s. They started playing, in the late 50s, they went from doing the Bladensburg Firehouse to playing the Dixie Pig on Bladensburg Road opposite Charlie Daniels and the Jaguars. Another band was the Savoys. They did the same thing. They played the West Lanham Hills Firehouse for years, and they wound up playing different nightclubs. And then a band that I profiled, I was really happy to get in there because these guys were absolutely amazing. One of the best bands that ever come out of this area, the Belvederes. They came out of Adelphi, and they contacted Don Dillard and said, we're every bit as good as Terry and the Pirates, your house band there. And Terry and the Pirates were a great band out of Southeast DC, and they started working some record hops for Don Dillard, but man, these guys played every club in DC. I mean, they did Strix, they did the Rocket Room, they did the Village Barn. They were, for a long time, the house band at the Silver Dollar on M Street into the 60s. I tell you, I'm very honored because 2 of their original members, the founding brothers, Tommy and Gina Dercola, are here today. So I thank you guys for coming out. They're in the front here. You guys really were part of a wave of rock and roll pioneers in this area. That's the way I see it. And that's, I try to write that up in the book. But I do a big section on the Belvederes and what a great band they were, and they kept it going for a while. Okay. So what happens now? We're moving through the 50s, and I can't get into everything. You get into the 60s, and everything's just kind of exploded. The Beatles at the Washington Coliseum changed everything. I do an in-depth chapter. I think it's probably the most in-depth chapter you're going to read on their appearance at the Coliseum. I include, everything from the exact amount of time they were on stage, and to the 4 DJs that shook hands with them, and the whole details of how they got there. I believe it is true. They were supposed to play the Bladensburg Fire Department first. It's another one of those things, like you hear that story. Did Led Zeppelin play the Wheaton Youth Center? Jeff Krulick's a great movie, but no, I talked to Don Dillard and did an interview, and he swears, he said, son, and he gave me the names, and I checked it out, and everything checked out. in late '63, Barry Richards and Don Dillard were working. They said, there's this band over in England that's going to go bonkers here. And they said, look, Don Dillard had booked some really big, he would book Bo Diddley and Link Rain as Rayman, and Little Danny and the Juniors, and all these other bands, Chubby Checker and Fats Domino, into the Bladensburg Fire Department in their second floor hall. And he had the thing booked. And the Beatles were going to play Bladensburg. It was going to be their first U.S. concert. And their first single came out in December '60, and they got a call and said, no way, we're doing the Washington Coliseum. But everything Don Dillard told me did, and Barry Richards did check out on that. So I do a chapter on that. But the '60s changed. In the mid '60s, you had big changes. And the thing I really like, I do 3 or 4 chapters in there about the cultural transformation of DuPont Circle. And there's another chapter about acid guru. LSD came into D.C., and the next thing you know, within a couple months, everybody was growing their hair long and dropping acid. And you had the Ambassador Theater. The Summer of Love came around. This amazing guy, Ian Fralick, who I did interview. Jeff hooked me up with him. He staged the first be-in Washington, D.C. in January '67. The first be-in was actually DuPont Circle, and then they would do them at the Peace Street Beach. And I talked to Ian. He said, the big venue was the Ambassador Theater that summer. So I do a whole chapter on the Ambassador. And of course, that's where Jimi Hendrix played, his first DC gig for, like a week-long thing there. And we get into all that. And Jeff's done a lot of work. Jeff Krulik, the filmmaker's done a lot of work on the Ambassador. There's a Facebook page on it, the Friends of the Ambassador Theater. So, things changed rapidly in the '60s. You went from almost kind of a rockabilly feel in the early '60s, to the British invasion. Georgetown exploded in the wake of the British invasion. All of a sudden you had all these live music nightclubs open up. You had the Round Table with the British Walkers. You had the Silver Dollar came around. The first band, the Cherry People, kind of took over there. Then it was Roy Buchanan moved in there in '68 with a band called the Uncalled For. And actually, it was in '67. The Cherry People took over in '68. The Crazy Horse had a band called the Chartbusters that did a mix of like doo-wop, but also British stuff. They had a big hit in '64 with She's the One. It was like a rip-off of the Beatles. You had the Mad Hatters at Max, down at 34th and M. You had the Fallen Angels all over the place. They were up at the Keg on Wisconsin Avenue. The Cellar Door was in full swing. I do a chapter called Wisconsin and M. It tells you the whole development of Georgetown, the Cellar Door, the history of that place. And the Shadows, which was very popular. It was actually in the original Cellar Door spot at 34th and M, and then moved over to 3125 M Street, and that's when the Mugwumps took over in the summer of '64, and that was Cass Elliot and Denny Doherty, who were later in the Mamas and the Papas. And, there's just so much. It's all in there. Everything then, country music was slowly fading out at this point. And, '68, you had the riots, and that changed a lot of stuff. They burned down 3 sections of D.C. mainly. They started up above 14th and U. In the wake of the riots, a lot of the rock and roll nightclubs closed up. A lot of them, like good examples of Starlight Restaurant, 14th and Irving. It was 1419 Irving Street. Now there's a Best Buy where it used to be. Opened in '54 with Jimmy Dean and his Texas Wildcats with Roy Clark on guitar. Switched over to rock and roll. It was a big rock and roll house for years. For much of 1965, the Outcasts were the house band with Roy Buchanan on guitar. And then after the riots, they switched it over to R&B and soul. Total cultural transformation there. And it was Steve Charles and the Soul Syndrome for a couple of years before they shut it down. But DC closed down. It took a few years into the early '70s when you had kind of a renaissance. But it's all in here. I do a whole history of the Bayou. I do a whole history of the Casino Royal Theater Restaurant in the Blue Mirror downtown. Do a whole history of the Crossroads in Bladensburg. The history on that place, it's amazing. Opened up in November of '41. It was a orchestra place, dance music, a dinner club. It was a strip joint. In the '50s, they took over. It was run by gamblers. Snags Lewis had a big run in that place for years. In '53, you had Tony Bennett play there for 2 weeks, followed by Guy Mitchell and then Patti Page. And these were like the biggest pop stars in the country at the time. Lenny Bruce did his first DC appearance in the late '40s at the Crossroads. He was second billed to some bunch of burlesque dancers, and the Ralph Hawkins Orchestra opened up. It's pretty amazing. George Sasloff took it over in 1960, turned it into a country music place. Dub Howington and the Tennessee Haymakers were the house band throughout much of the decade. Danny Denver and the Soundmasters came in '69 with Roy Buchanan on guitar. They were playing everything, country, blues, rock, Elvis. They mixed it up. Buchanan became a legend. It's very sad to drive by there. The building is still standing at Crossroads, but it's owned by a medical supply company in Bowie. They've done nothing with it for 6 years. So you look back, I mean, I'll just wind it up by saying, you look back at all this, and it changes. Every decade is different. It's very sad that so many of the great old nightclubs are now long gone in DC and in the suburbs. You know, here in Mount Rainier, they tore down Bass's down at 3208 Rhode Island Avenue, right on the DC line, and that they used to have a great nightclub in the basement called Sonny's Turntable Lounge. And Roy Buchanan, he married, his wife Judy, who was from Mount Rainier, in '61, and like 61 to 65, he'd go up to Philadelphia and do session work for different bands, and then come down and play in the Turntable Lounge, do jam sessions down there. And the Senate Inn on Marlboro Pike, another great rock and roll place. Different types of music. I found ads in January of '59 for a 1 week. The MC was Mickey Rooney for the burlesque dance shows. And I looked up in his biography, and he said, yeah, in the late '50s he went through a really tough period where he couldn't get movie deals, and he was doing nightclub work. And of course they teetered back and forth between rock and roll. That was a crazy place. Larry Brannon owned it, was managing it, and he said there's too many fights in there. There's the old Capitol Heights guys and the Southeast guys coming in and fighting each other. And I think one of the last bands to play there was the Roslyn Mountain Boys, Joe Triplett, and they just said that's you'd walk in there, it's just beer bottles flying and people trying to kill each other. Anyway, so what I did is I wrote all this stuff up. It took forever. It was over 1,100 pages. I couldn't find a publisher to do it. A lot of publishers are interested in them. They said, well, we don't take anything over 300 pages. And I was like, come on, 300 pages, that's a pamphlet for me. I could do that on my lunch break. I'm not putting people down. I'm not putting anybody down, but 300 pages is not a book. It's your personal, journal entry. I don't know what it is. No, it's the thing's, going to be 1,200, 1,500 pages. And I said, put it in 2 volumes. I said, no, people don't want, they're not even going to buy this in 1 volume. It's too damn expensive. I mean, if all you get up and walk out, if you don't want to buy it, that's fine, just go. But it's expensive. You can't do 2 volumes. You can't ask people to buy 2 books. I said, I want the story from beginning to end, the way I uncovered it, the way I researched it. So we had to cut stuff, and a lot of stuff got cut, but it's in my computer. It will resurface. Whether those damn publishers like it or not, it's going to leak out at some point. But no, they tinkered. They knocked it down from like 11-point type to 9-point type, which you need a magnifying glass. And the margins went way out. And I'm like, this is just crazy. But anyway, the book came out finally. It's available, and it's basically my life's work. I'm now in a situation where I just can't devote time to these things. I'm taking care of some family issues. I just can't do it, and I can't do these book signings. I can't do these presentations. If I could, I do 1 a week, and we have offers all over DC. Jeff and myself have a lot to do joint stuff. History presentations between his films and the crap that I've written, and do all this stuff. So, I did what I could. I got the book out, and it's called Rock the Potomac. It's 811 mind-boggling pages of probably factual material that you've probably never seen anywhere else. That is it in a nutshell. What I want to do now, we are going to run a little late, and I feel bad for the bands that volunteered to come here and play, because we have some great music going at least till 5 o'clock. I hope you stick around. I want to do some question and answers. And I think we have some wireless mics. So if anybody has any questions, I can answer them. Then we're going to move out to the front room and sign books. So Dorian and the Wizard of Sound, Frank Kaiser. Does anybody have a question you want to ask?
I'm trying to get back there. How are we doing? Who goes first? There you go. Go ahead.
Didn't the other person?
Doesn't matter. You got the mic.
Okay. Do you have any long-term plans to incorporate any of the material you weren't able to put in this book into any work you may do in the future?
Yeah, my only long-term plan is to go home and go to bed. Yes, to answer your question, yes. I'm going to have to, because if you've ever written, like if you're an artist, And I do view myself in that way, although it's a little shaky at times. I mean, if you're a musician, you're always going to be making music, whether you have an audience or not. And I think sometimes the best music comes when it's just, the musician and the instrument in the room. Yeah, if you're a painter, you're always going to be painting and doing art. In terms of writing, I'm always going to be writing something. And yes, the material that got cut, I think, is too valuable to let it go dormant, especially the Howard Theater listing. And there's a whole different thing. It's like the legends. I kind of got inspired. Jeff Krulik did this movie, Led Zeppelin Played Here, about whether or not Zepp played the Wheaton Youth Center. I've been told a whole bunch of crazy stories about musicians in the DC area that may or may not be true, but it's not incriminating. It's like, I'll give you one example, and I wrote a lot of this stuff up, and it's just one after another. It's an old Roy Buchanan story. Buchanan was worshipped at the Crossroads. And he's playing there with Danny Denver. And they played blues rock, and he's playing a slow thing. The Pagans Motorcycle Club kind of came in and made it their unofficial home base for a little bit. And according to what I've been told by like 24 people who say they were there that night, the Pagans got some guy in the side of the room, and they're just wailing on this guy and beating the crap out of him. And Buchanan was playing the guitar, and he was doing the solo, and the solo slows down, and Buchanan just nods his head over towards the Pagans, and the Pagans start hitting each other in the shoulder. The bikers are going, he's looking at it, and they're like there, and Buchanan just goes, shakes his head, and automatically all the Pagans just kind of like bow their heads, and they go up to the guy, start brushing them off, blood dripping out, and getting their bandanas and cleaning them up, and then they walk the guy over to a booth, they bought him a beer, and patting him on the back and all that, and Buchanan's just sitting there, and when they got him in the booth and everything, and then Buchanan looks at the band and just goes, shh, and they broke right back into the song. Okay, did that happen or not? I don't know. What I do know is that I've heard it so many times, and it's almost always the same story. It's not because I'm telling the story over and over, it's because other guys are coming out and actually volunteering it. So, yeah, there's material like that. There's a ton of it, and there's always new Nightclub material coming out that there's going to be some kind of additional work. I just don't know what the scope of it is. It's not going to be 800 pages, and it's not going to be 12 years of my life down the drain.
I know what you're saying. I'm an improvisatory musician myself.
I know. Well, very good. Okay.
Yeah, I want to, first of all, I've had my copy for 2 months, Mark, and I'm still plowing through it. It's great stuff. I want to thank you for your incredible detective work.
Thank you.
Because one of the mysteries you solved for me personally was one of the artists that you highlight in this book, Tacoma Park native John Fahey, wrote in his book how bluegrass destroyed my life, how he remembers in a dream, he was 11 or 12 years old, and his parents took him on a boat, and he says, I saw Hank Williams on the Potomac River, and people said, that can't happen, that couldn't happen, didn't happen, and sure enough, Connie B. Gay in here, if you could talk about that a little bit, that'd be great.
I don't know a whole lot about that. I did 2 interviews with John Fahey before he passed away, and he was in a bad state. He had neurological problems. The thing with the 2 books that he wrote, and the one you're talking about, how bluegrass music destroyed my life, there's pieces of fiction in there, and they don't really know what's accurate, what isn't. I think most of it's really truth. I think it's based on his truth. Hank Williams was booked, and I give a whole list of people that Connie B. Gay brought up from the Grand Ole Opry and stuff to play those moonlight cruises on the Wilson line. And if I recall correctly, Hank Williams, again, God rest his soul, what a great talent. I love his singing. I'm not even really a country music fan that much, but the guy was phenomenal, and he died at a young age, like 29. And I'm certain that night the house band was Jimmy Dean and his Texas Wildcats playing for him, because they were the house band for all those shows. And after that particular gig, he actually moved in with Connie B. Gay in his house in Arlington for a couple months, and then it just, the problems with alcohol got too bad, and then he passed away. But that's what I know about it. But yeah, it did happen. There's another Hank Wilson gig I mentioned in there, and it was at one of the hotels. I forget it. I'm ashamed to say it's information overload. It was like the 2400 Hotel. It was like 57 or 58. He played a hotel gig in DC, and it was really unusual. But if no index, so you got to go through every page. Yeah, that's another thing I want to say. All the index whiners, this is my revenge on you people. People come up, yeah, I got your book, no index. No index. I'm saying, what about the 811 pages of material that you're not going to find anywhere else on this musician, that musician, your mother, your uncle, everybody who's in? No index. Okay. there's a reason. The thing was, originally like 1,400 pages. How do you index a book that mentions like over 1,000 bands, musicians, nightclubs? Because if I don't mention, Billy Bob Smith, who played one gig in D.C. and then went back to wherever the heck he was from, Billy Bob Smith will come back from the grave and be bugging me about why he wasn't, in the book and wasn't in the index. You couldn't do an index for that size. We were so strapped for time. I'd love to do it. I do not hate indexes. I have no problem with them. I couldn't do it. It's just one of those things you cannot do. It just couldn't be done. So please, don't ask me about the indexes. No, I didn't forget it. It just wasn't going to happen. Okay, any other questions?
Yeah. Could you, Mark?
Yeah.
Could you talk a little bit about the Greenbelt rock and roll guys?
Yeah, I forgot all about to mention Greenbelt. There's a whole section on the development of Greenbelt's teen club scene, and it goes back to the 1940s with the Drop-In. The Drop-In was originally a youthful teen club. I give the whole history of it. It was in the basement of what is now the pizza place over there in the barber shop. And it was there for a few years, and then they moved it to a prefabricated trailer home, and they put it out here in the corner of this parking lot at the end of 9 Court Parkway. And they had different, or they called them orchestras. It was like Greenbelt teens would come in and play music. And in the late 50s, they moved it up to the center school, which is now the community center, in the gymnasium. And you had some good bands play there. The Off-Keys did a teen dance up there in the late 50s, and Terry and the Pirates played there a lot. It spawned, it encouraged Greenbelt youth to get involved in music. And you had a lot of great musicians come out in the 60s, specifically, and I profiled them in the book. And there's guys like, Rick Ransom, a great keyboard player, played in the Rockin' Rejects. He was in a band called Donnie and the Diablos that are featured. And that was Donnie Dorsey Sr., Double D. Donnie Jr.'s here today, my good friend. That was his dad. He formed that band. And they were a huge attraction at the Greenbelt Youth Center in the 60s, from like 64 to 67. The two main bands at the Greenbelt Youth Center and their teen club dances were Donnie and the Diablos and Lawrence and the Arabians. And Donnie and the Diablos had some guys, some great guys. Lee Dorsey was in the band, Rick Ransom played with them. Their drummer, Marcus Cuff, went on and played with Sky Cobb. He played with Emmylou Harris for several years in the early 70s, lived with her over on Garland Avenue in Tacoma Park. He's on her first 2 albums. He's a drummer. And then he went and drummed with like a new wave band, an MTV band, the Textones. And you can find their stuff on Rhino Records. But he was from Hyattsville, and he played in Donnie and the Diablos. I get into the Midnight Marauders, old Duke Perry, who's sitting out here in the center every day. He was their lead singer. Donnie and the Diablos, they used to have to go and rent out the Greenbelt Armory. Their following was so strong. So that's what Greenbelt youth did in the 50s. There's also a couple other great guys. Richard Dickie Dog Tipton got profiled in here. He was a great guitarist. Profile his career. He played with some great country and western bands later on. The guy who never got the recognition he deserved from Greenbelt, great guitarist, was a fellow named Terry Gleason. They called him T.I. Gleason. Terry, went to Parkdale. I think he was class of '71 at Parkdale, and he played in a whole slew of bands. He was playing at the Paragon and Zillion and Mirage, and the hot band there was Rocks that he was in. He was playing the old Bambinos in a band called Max, and he introduced the great drummer Tim Barry to Frank Marino while they were playing at Bambinos. They were playing. Tim Barry was drumming for Fast Eddie. Terry was playing guitar for Max. Anyway, in 1981. Terry Gleason decided to split Greenbelt and go to the Bay Area. And he proceeded, in the following years, he joined up with John Lee Hooker and was his second guitarist for over 18 years. He also toured and performed and recorded with Eddie Money, and he played with Greg Allman for a while. There's some other artists out there. He did a West Coast tour with Frank Marino and Mahogany Rush in the 80s. I was watching, I used to watch MTV every day. I thought it was amazing. I really regret that thing ever went away, but Neil Young used to do a bridge benefit every year, and one year, and this is probably like mid or late 80s, I don't recall, but Neil Young headlined the bridge benefit, and it was out of Redwood City, California, and John Lee Hooker was the co-headliner, and John Lee Hooker's on stage playing, and I'm watching it, and there's this guy behind him playing rhythm guitar. It was frickin' Terry Gleason, and I was like, geez, he's from Greenbelt, and he's out there with Hooker playing that. So a word on Terry Gleason. We became friends. He came back here to help take care of his mother who had cancer. She passed. He went out to the Eastern Shore, lived in Queenstown. I mean, one of the things I really regret, this is getting off track a little bit, but he called me up and said, I'm playing in a band called Blues Church. I'm giving guitar lessons. I'm doing all right. We're having this big party. Come on out. I didn't do it. A few weeks later, they had a report of somebody had driven their car up to the Bay Bridge, and they thought the guy jumped over, and then they found Terry's body in December 2004. God rest his soul. He had demons. He tried to escape in California. He was very frank about it. I can't go into this stuff, but he was a good guy. He was a great Greenbelt guy. He just, these things get to you, and you can't beat them sometimes. But a great Greenbelt guy, great Greenbelt musician. From '81 until I guess around 2002 or so, over 20 years out on the West Coast, and he made an album with Valid Cup. He played on her album. He was featured in his profile in Rock the Potomac. I mentioned he was profiled in Guitar Player magazine, for the work, the blues stuff he was doing. He was a great guitarist. But that's the one Greenbelt musician I think about. There was others. Seth Justman grew up in the 3/4 Crescent and went to. He played in the Blues Bag, played in the Open Road Band, not the Steve Carey Open Road Band, but another one in the late 60s at the teen dance scene with Greg Pouillet, who lives up on Research Road now, and Greg later played in Sky Cow. But Seth Justman, in 10th grade, moved out to Braybrook, down Greenbelt Road, and he went to Hawthorne School in D.C., graduated in '69. A year later went to Boston, was a founding member of the Jake Giles Band, still with them today. He's on all their albums, wrote a bunch of their hits, Centerfold and all that. He was a Greenbelt kid, and of course my other favorite that totally forgotten, one of the greatest drummers in rock and roll history, Ron Bushy of Iron Butterfly, that great drum solo in In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida. I did an interview with Ron because he had gone to GW High School in Alexandria, where Jim Morrison went, and John Phillips and Cass Elliot and all these other people. We finished the interview, and he goes, well, where are you from? And I said, I'm from Greenbelt. And he goes, you're kidding. I said, no. He goes, well, my dad was stationed at the Pentagon. He said, when I was born in 1941, I lived at Greenbelt till I was like 7 or 8 years old. And I said, well, where did you live? And he goes, 7C Southway. And he goes, not only that, he said, that drum solo in In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida? I said, yeah. And he goes, I started that thing on the couch when I was living in Southway. He said, that house inspired me. He said he never took a drum lesson in his life. But, it was something in the wood of Greenbelt. So anyway, you listen to In-A-Gadda-Da-Vida, one of the greatest songs in the history of music, I guess, and you hear that thing, and that Ron Bushy drum solo, that drumming, that's a Greenbelt kid. I don't care who says what. He was here a long time ago, but he's here. And he recently had to retire from Iron Butterfly. He was the last original member, so Iron Butterfly is out there with no original members. But they put on their website with Ron Bushy's blessing. Yeah, so we're supposed to go see him play and say, hey, there's Ron Bushy's blessing, Iron Butterfly. But he was a Greenbelt guy and a great drummer. Anything here? Yes. Hey.
Hi there. Do you know if where Marvin Gaye started playing around here, and also do you know if Elvis Presley ever did anything before he became big? Just came to town and.
Yeah, I do two things in the book. There's a section on Stars of Rhythm and Blues, and I do a rundown, a little profile on the R&B people in D.C. And it's like, Shirley Horn and Billy Stewart, and I cover Marvin Gaye, and I cover. Van McCoy, I cover the Clovers, and they're all like in this chapter. Marvin Gaye, did grow up in D.C., and he played in some vocal groups. He was doing like doo-wop music in D.C., and I kind of, the names escape me now, but I want to say that he was in the Moonglows for a little bit, I don't know, but yeah, there's a section on him in the book. I just don't have time to pull the thing up right now. And as far as Elvis Presley goes, I do cover that, the first D.C. concert he ever did. And I know there's people who have read this. Was it March of '56 on the Wilson line? They got docked that night because a boiler or something, an engine blew, and they had to, I give the whole thing. The opening band was Melvin Price and the Santa Fe Rangers. Elvis came out and did 2 sets. After the second set, reportedly just stood around and talked with people. There was a great article in the city paper. I reference that in the chapter on that, or the little section I do. It was booked by Connie B. Gay. He was basically on the verge of, he was a country guy going rock and roll at the time. That was '56. Elvis later came back and did some really strange gigs. I think a couple shows at the Cole Field House in the early '70s. Might have done one at the Cap Center. I'm not sure of that, but it's in there. It's buried in there. But the first gig he ever did was in 1956, before he was well known. On the Wilson line. It was docked at Pier 4, never left Pier 4. on the southwest waterfront. Pier 4 is still there. I was just down there a couple months ago taking pictures. They've destroyed the southwest waterfront. They knocked everything over. You know, all those old buildings and bars and stuff that were down there, and it's now, you know, Anthem and a whole bunch of nightclubs and stuff. But that Pier 4, the front of it is still there. It's pretty cool. So, yeah, it's in there. It's Elvis's March 1956 appearance on the SS Mount Vernon. It was booked by Connie B. Gay, and that was his first in the D.C. area. Anything else?
Really quick.
Yeah.
Not as pop as Elvis, but for the DC area, probably one of the acts that a lot of people have heard about. But your best anecdote about Boy Slim and the Fashion?
Do you really want to hear this? Because
Yes.
I tell the story. I have a friend named Brian who's not here, but his buddy Chris Hall of the Hall Brothers is here. And Brian, his last name shall remain nameless, who I met at the Riverdale Pizza Pub. He was going to beat me up one night because I said the Philadelphia Eagles, you know, weren't as good as the Redskins, and he's a diehard fan. Anyway, he told me, he said, you know, we're talking about all these bands they used to have at Bambino's before it turned into the Riverside Inn, and it was a weird mix because they had bluegrass and then they brought in some local rock and roll stuff. And he goes, nope, best band ever was Root Boy Slim and the Sex Change Band. And I said, really? Well, why is that? And, you know, I had to ask, and he goes, here was the whole show. He said, you know, the place was filled up, and we're all waiting for him to come out. And the band came out and played, you know, the little opening, you know, instrumental thing, and they're looking around for Root Boy, and no sign of him. All of a sudden, this guy comes stumbling out of the like little bathroom area against the back wall, and walked right up to Brian's table, and goes, bleh, and everything came out, just erupted, vomited all over the table, and then went face down, and he was on his knees face down, and reportedly, everybody in Bambino's, it was called Bambino's at the time, stood up and gave him a standing ovation. And the band members, you know, came over and dragged him, and they dragged him out to the parking lot, end of the show. Nobody asked for that. And that was it. Greatest performance ever of Root Boy Slim and the Sex Change Band. If it's true, then that would be in the book on, you know, these stories that may or may not have actually happened. That's supposedly happened. Yes.
Mark, thank you for all the work on the excellent book.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you.
Two questions, please.
Yeah.
Did the Nowhere Men play as the first band at the 1962 opening of the Greenbelt Youth Center? And did Larry Kidwell himself book the Armory because of the overflow crowd of teenagers?
Good questions. The Nowhere Men formed in July of 1966. All 5 members, I do a chapter on it in the book, all 5 members were out at Northwestern High School, Steve Valenti and Tommy Rodante, and okay, now the second question was about
Lawrence and the Arabians.
Okay, Lawrence and the Arabians. I knew Larry Kidwell really well, and I do an in-depth chapter on Lawrence and the Arabians in this book, and I give you the accurate original lineup. You know, Dennis Monk helped me with a lot of that stuff, and Dennis lives up in Hillside now. He was an original sax player in the band. Anyway, they started out as a 4-piece. They were so popular. The Greenbelt team dances, they would alternate. They started doing them in the municipal room, which had a capacity of 50. It's a small room. You walk in the youth center by the water fountain, you go to your right, there's an exit that takes you out to Bradenfield. That little area on the right, they used to have bands there. Bands got too popular, they put them in the gym. The gym had a capacity at the time of 520. I think the legal capacity now is about 280. It's not that big. They started filling up that gym every weekend, and they were there frequently from 64 to 67. Larry Kidwell, as I understand it, took it upon himself to book on his own the Greenbelt Armory, and the first show they ever did there, I believe, was January 10th, 1966, co-billed with the English Setters, the band that became the Cherry People. And that was Doug and Chris Grimes and Punky Meadows and Jan Zukowski and Rocky Isaac and those guys. That was the first time they did the Greenbelt Armory. They did several shows after that. And the Greenbelt Armory, I have that official capacity, but they claim they drew about 700 people in there, so they kept going back there. According to Larry Kidwell, it was his doing. He booked it and brought in, knew the guys in the English Setters, and they were out of Southeast DC. And they became the Cherry People. But yeah, it was supposed to be like a monster show there, and that kicked off, a regular diet. You had bands at the Greenbelt Youth Center playing. You had Greenbelt Armory. You had a little facility called the Ridge Road Center, which is now the Greenridge House. They tore it down and put up the Greenridge House. You had bands all over the place. So, yeah, another guy I want to mention, Joe Martone. He was another Greenbelt guy who Played in a band called Menagerie, the last band to ever play the Greenbelt Youth Center in March of '76. They were like a power punk trio before you had punk music. And John Novick, who you see walking around the center a lot, was the drummer in that band. And Kevin Grady, I think his name was, from College Park, and he did original material, and they did The Who and the Yardbirds and the Kinks. And Joe Martone was from Greenbelt, and he wound up being a great keyboard player. He played with Chuck Berry. He did the R&B tours with, you know, the Platters and the Drifters and the Coasters and all this. And now he's playing the casino circuit as a solo, doing, you know, singing and keyboards. So he was a Greenbelt guy. So, okay, got off the subject there, but that's what happens.
All right, so you mentioned Magruder Park. Have you gotten into yet shows that happened at Have you gotten into yet shows that happened at that youth center?
What youth center?
At Magruder Park.
No, Magruder Park did not continue the shows there, as far as I could tell. They did. I could never find it, because what happened was Prince George's Plaza Community Center opened in 1968. They took everything. They had a show there in Halloween weekend 1970. It was Mitch Ryder and the Detroit Wheels. So they were getting some, they had a capacity of 280 in that gym. And they started booking a lot of the teen bands that were playing the whole circuit. But Magruder Park, if they did have shows, I'm unfamiliar with them, which means they didn't advertise them. But that was just a big 4th of July thing the Nowhere Men did.
So that was a structure that's not there anymore? Or?
I don't know where they played. It may have been a makeshift stage somewhere, which I'm probably thinking it was, because I don't think they had a regular playing area there. I could be wrong, but again, it never showed up. And the thing is, I went by the words of musicians. No musicians ever told me they played at Magruder Park other than the Nowhere Men, so, you know, who knows? Yes?
So for us younger kids,
Yeah.
do you have you written about, or do you plan to write about bands like Grave Robbers with Carl Straub and Last Train Home?
I would love to, but I can't do it. It's too far. My boundary goes from the first 25 years of rock and roll, which was 51 to about 76. I stopped in 76 at Bicentennial because everything changed. You had the end of the Vietnam War in 75. When you look at the history, there was a big shift in the counterculture after the end of the Vietnam War, because a lot of the people who were putting their lives on the line and protesting, they didn't have anything left to protest after that. It's just a fact. It phased out for a couple years. It kind of died out. Music changed drastically, and this is something I really stand behind. At the end of the Vietnam War, and whatever it was, April '75, within a year or two, you had all the music changing. You had disco come in, new wave, you know, punk somewhere between 76, 77. A lot of the old nightclubs of the 60s in DC were gone. They ended the teen dance scene in the youth centers and churches in the summer of '76, because if you go back and read the old Prince George's Journal, there's a terrible PCP epidemic amongst the high school kids in Prince George. Busing came in. You know, the whites were hitting the road. It's just a fact. There was tremendous white flight. Everything was changing. There were racial skirmishes. There were fights. I talked to the guys who were doing the Greenbelt Youth Center, Hank Irving and Rick Mest. And they were running, Rick Mest was running Cava, and he said, we couldn't do it anymore because it's not just putting a band and putting the kids in there. He said, you're getting kids from all over the DC area, and there were fights left and right out in the parking lots. And he said, there's drugs all over the place, and it wasn't normal drugs like pot. It was, you know, PCP and angel dust and killer weed, you know, KW. And all. It was a whole different shift at that time. Greenbelt was autonomous. They weren't under the Prince George's County Department of Recreation. When they pulled the plug on their teen dances, everybody followed suit, though. I think I went to one of the last teen dances ever. It was at St. Hugh's Church in Grenoble Hall. I saw Highway Star play there, and that was probably around August of '76. I never found a reference to another, you know, teen dance on the scene after that. So everything changed. To answer your question, everything changed in that '76 period. I lost interest after that, because if I kept doing research, I'd lose my mind. I'd have to interview 500 punk rock musicians, and you know, rockabilly became really big, and you know, roots. There was no such thing as roots in the '60s or early '70s. It was rock and roll. There's rockabilly or rock and roll or country rock, and now all of a sudden you got roots and you got, you know, alt. I don't know what the hell alt is. Alt this, alt that, alt, you know, whatever. Yeah, I don't know what they're calling this stuff today. To me, I go back to Billboard, the original thing. It was pop, country and western, rhythm and blues, and rock and roll, you know, came in. And I just label everything under those four. I'll stick it under one of those four categories, whether they like it or not. But no, there's too many bands, you know, out there that came alive. And you know, in the '80s, I was lost. In the '90s, there's just too much to cover. So there's plenty of talented writers out there who can cover that period.
Question over here.
Yeah, then we're going to wind it down. I want the band to come up here, and I want to go out in the front and sign books. So another question.
Okay,
Tim.
Mark, hey, thanks for this. Did you do any research or do any writing on Wilmer's Park?
No, because what happened with Wilmer's Park, they did have shows, but they were number one, they were sporadic. Number two, they were totally undocumented. I could never find a single, advertisement in any of the local newspapers about shows at Wilmer's Park. It's not to say they didn't happen. They did. They're part of the Chitlin circuit, but it just wasn't advertised, and I couldn't do much with it. And musicians I talked to, the local musicians, didn't really play there. It was out-of-town acts that were playing at the Howard Theater. So they had this unofficial, little roadhouse circuit going, Evans Grill and, Wilmer's Park to a much lesser extent. And but it was, Howard Theater spin-offs. And Wilmer's Park just, I looked and looked, and there was just, in the 60s and 70s, it was very dry there. So no, and again, that was Brandywine. You're getting down towards southern Maryland. I have a real issue. People take issue with me about Washington, D.C. area. And here's the interesting thing, when I was doing this book, and it came to light really when I did the Jim Morrison book, growing up in Alexandria. The people who grew up in Northern Virginia in the 50s and 60s wanted nothing to do with D.C. They weren't D.C. area. Potomac River was more than a river. It was a huge cultural boundary. And, the guys who went to, Morrison was class of 61. It was a long time ago, class of 61 at GW High School. But they're telling me, we used to get Robert E. Lee's birthday off. Every storefront in King Street up to the late 60s had Confederate flags. They said this town was Southern, and we hated D.C. We didn't like the Union at all. You're Yankees. And I'm like, well, okay. That's what you're telling me, but it was over and over and over. So Alexandria was a weird place, and then they were gone within 5 or 6 years. In the 70s, it totally went, blue and Democrat. The whole culture changed. But I have a hard time now trying to fit in Alexandria and Arlington as Northern Virginia, because the people at that formative period, 50s and 60s, prior to the mid-70s, they didn't see themselves as Washingtonians. The people down there who are there now might say they are, but back then they did. They not only, they hated the area. I remember talking to Stan Durkee, who was a Morrison friend. He was like the valedictorian, I think, that year at GW. He said, our teachers would give us a bunch of crap. He said, what, a Southern school not good enough for you? You had to go to UVA. They didn't want you going over the Potomac River, period. So it was weird. There's a cultural thing. So really, Washington, D.C. area, when I think of it, the first 25 years, up to 1975, it was basically D.C. and PG County. To a lesser extent, Montgomery County. Montgomery County was more affluent. They did have some good venues, Wheaton Youth Center, Bethesda. PG and D.C. had the roadhouses. They had the really rough bars, the Crossroads, and the Varsity Grill with the bikers. And Southeast D.C. just was a mess of, crazed, I don't even know how to describe. 1023 restaurant was nuts, and you'd go in there and people just try to kill each other and listen to music a little bit and then go back to killing each other. So, Shelter Room in Anacostia up to the 70s. Anacostia was, they ignored it. It was like 90% white up until the riots, and they had these bars, the Shanty, the Stagecoach, the Victory Grill, the Beehive, which became the Branding Iron. I'm like, who calls a bar the Branding Iron? So you walk in and you find out. It was crazy down there in the Southeast, and then those guys they disappeared overnight. The riots came in, and next thing you know, I remember, it's getting off on a different subject, but I talked to a guy, Ron Covell, who was in a band called the DC Magnetones. He was an Anacostia High class of 68. He's a white guy, and he said, hey, we lived in Anacostia our whole life. But I'm in my senior year, we had the riots. So suddenly all my black friends, they're not talking to me. They're throwing bricks at our house. And he goes, 10 houses that summer on whatever street he was on, T Street or whatever, in the heart of Anacostia, gone. The white folks gone, and there was like a 2-year period where it just went 90% one culture, 90% to the other. And now I'm not pronouncing judgment or anything, for God's sakes. I'm not. It's just it's a fact that there is. The point is demographic change. It affects the music scene. That's the whole point. There was no more country music in Anacostia after '68, and the Shanty. I mean, I don't know how they did it. They kept bringing rock and roll. Billy Hancock used to play there with the Stingers, and all these other guys would go in there. And that building is still there on Good Hope Road, but that soldiered on until about 1973. I can't even imagine going in that place in '73 and what it must have been like. But the whole thing is, the culture's changed, and music changes with the culture. So, okay. Any other question?
One last question.
One last question. We're going to move out, and I'll be signing books. You can come up and ask me anything you like. Yes.
Are there some other interesting people in the room that you didn't get a chance to mention?
Yeah. In the room?
In the room.
Well, all of you. Yes, you, Jerry. You're the most interesting of all. Yeah. The gentleman behind you, Barry Holber. What a great drummer. He has a profile in there. Barry plays some great bands. He played with D. Clay and the Graduates. D. Clay, the old guitarist from Hattie Bumpo, they used to play the Ambassador. You played with him for many years. You were the drummer of the great band Cherry Smash. That played at the Bayou for years. At the Bayou in the early 70s, it was Face Dancer, Cherry Smash, Sinbad and the Cherry People, and the Nighthawks.
And I have a gig today. I got to get you to sign my book so I can go to work.
Current drummer for the Fabulous Hubcaps. The other thing I want to say is, I've made many friends with guys who play at the New Deal. We have a table over here. We have the great Paul Masterdone of the Pulverizers. He has a profile in there. Used to play with Maxwell Parachute back in the early rock and roll years. Steve Carey, he was the bass player for many great bands. He opened Road Band for years, which used to be the house band for Riverdale Pizza Club, where I first saw him play. And Chris Hall, I love the Hall brothers. I'm a huge fan of Chick Hall Jr.'s brother Chris. Singer bassist of the Hall brothers, their father Chick Hall Sr. owned the surf club on Bladensburg Road. I give a whole history of that place before they moved in 1975 over to Kenilworth Avenue. I got to tell you one story before we go, and I could be here all night. I did a really cool. This is nuts because I did an interview with Chick Hall Sr. because I would see him. I first started going to the surf club on Kenilworth Avenue in '82. And I taped the interview with Chick Hall. That thing would be priceless today. And with about 50 of the tapes from the original Capitol Rock collection, I think they got boxed up and thrown out in one of our purgings. But Chick Hall Sr. told me the story. He'd had the surf club. This is around '59. And I think I put this in the book. I'm not sure. But it was a weeknight. I think he said it was a rainy weeknight, typical night. Not many people would come in. And Chick Hall's doing his thing. I guess, who was he in there? Johnny Foster was with him. And, he had his little... Useless White, yeah, and Ulysses White, Useless White, and Johnny Foster, they were playing their thing. And he looks up, and in comes Roy Clark. Roy Clark would sit on the corner of the stage to watch his guitar licks. Boom, another table. Looks over, here comes, Jimmy Dean and the Texas Wildcats, his whole band. And looks up, and boom. There's, Patsy Cline, along with the members of Bill Peer and his Melody Boys. They sit there, and looks in the far corner, and there's Dub Hallington and the Tennessee Haymakers, and the new kids on the block at the time, Charlie Daniels and the Jaguars. So there's 10, not many people in the club, but the whole place is now filled up with these musicians. They're all playing in the area. Like Roy Clark, I guess, was at the Rendezvous, and I think they said Jimmy Dean, they were doing the 4400 Club or the Rustic Cabin. I think Patsy Cline might have been doing... it might have been Oxon Hill Fire Department or the Crossroads. I think I mentioned in the book. But anyway, they're all sitting there. So Chick Hall does his set, plays the guitar, and they're all glued to him. And he finishes playing the set, and they all just stand up and do their polite little claps. They get into single file and trot right on out and go back to their gigs. because that was a typical weeknight. And, you had some of the greatest musicians, popular music history there, but they would come and pay homage to. Chick Hall Sr., I do a chapter on him. He was really good friends with Jimmy Dean, and Link Ray came up here because of Chick Hall Sr. Up from the Tidewater area, but you have to read about that in the book. Okay, what I want to do is I'm going to try to get the books out of here, out of this room, into the front room. We have some great music that we're going to be doing. I think it's going to go at least till 5 o'clock, maybe run a little over. Tonight you have a great band, Shannon Bielski, and I think it's Moonlight Drive. They're a great band, and they're going from 7 to 9. I want to remind everybody, hit the bar, tip the bartenders, order drinks. You can still order the food, I think, at the front, so make sure you do that. Okay, I'm going to sit down at the table. If you want to come by and say hello or look at the book or even purchase a book, I have to tell you, it is exorbitant. The book costs $30. That is a discount off of what you buy it online. I'm only taking cash I can't do credit cards. There's an ATM machine across the way. If you promise me you've never bounced a check in your life, I'll take a check. No IOUs, no Jiffy Lube coupons, and no half-smoked joints. I don't smoke pods. But I love people who do, so, and I love people who want to give me $30 for this thing. So, folks, it's Rock the Potomac, and I want to thank all of you for making this a great afternoon.
All right, let's hear it for Mark Opsasnick one more time. This guy, an encyclopedia of local music history, is amazing. And a raconteur. I mean, this guy could talk. He could probably talk for a few more hours, but he's right. We do have some music coming up. He's talked about some stuff pre-1976, but we got some really great acts, contemporary acts in the local rock and roll scene for you today. We'll probably start in about 15-20 minutes. We got Dar Stelabata, who is going to be like opening up everything. We got The Bachelor, The Bad Actress. Yeah, and then exactly. And then we've got this band called Owl Pack. And maybe in a couple of years, Mark will be including all of us in the addendum to Rock the Potomac. But anyway, we'll be getting that on in about 10-15 minutes with Dar Stelabata. And like Mark said, he will be signing books and selling books in the front room. But he's already starting to make sales here, folks. So if you want a copy of it, you better get up to see Mark as soon as possible. Anyway, like I said, we'll have Dar Stelabata in about 10-15 minutes. Let's hear it for Mark Opsasnick one more time.
Whose microphone is this? I don't know. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah. Wow.
That's pretty good.
Yes. That was in
Mark, encyclopedic.
That's it. He's definitely, that's why I called him the Great One.
Yeah.
I used to like,
But she's going to play a half hour.
I don't know where that started. Yeah, they call somebody the Great One. They call him the Great One.
well, Jackie Grace, that was where I got it. And I was just like, the guy was so impressive that I started, that was the moniker I gave him. I was telling Steve, somebody's got to help him get out. Somebody's got to help him.
I helped Lord Steve and I helped
I want to help get him out to the, he's never going to make it out there. I mean, I don't know how to, I don't know what we can do.
I don't know, I don't want to take it out there and somebody steal it.
Well, no, I mean, I'm just saying, I don't know. He needs a manager right now.
I thought he had friends at that table.
Oh, yeah, like Nancy or let me go just...
Yeah, Nancy and...
yeah, you know what? He's fine. I mean, there he is. Well, let's see what he
The boxes aren't heavy. If you feel like helping, the boxes aren't heavy.